Today I was going to talk about Saab. We're not talking about the cars. We all see college professors and engineers driving them around. Uh, Not very many people are aware of the fact that Saab actually produced aircraft for quite a number of years. And primarily Saab um, was a producer of military aircraft, but there was a number of years there where they produced civilian aircraft. It was called the Saab 340. And this is another one of those airplanes that I have always just enjoyed. Every time I see one, I think that's a good looking airplane. And you don't really see them around much anymore. There was a number of years though where they were heavily used, um, but that time seems to have gone by. Saab is a Swedish company, and in the 1970s they began producing their prototype for what would become the 340. And they were looking to create an airplane that would be good for short haul and regional carrier flights. And in the end, they decided to go with the turboprop engines as opposed to a jet engine, which unfortunately, in the end, was one of the many factors that led to the ultimate demise of the 340 and their ceasing of its production, just not being able to compete with the jet market. But the 340 had its first flight in 1983 and went into general population in 84, and they continued to produce it all the way up until 1999. At the time that they stopped producing the 340, there was around 460 of them that had been built. The 340 was a really popular airplane among regional airlines for many years. It was capable and it was powerful, fast, but it was small. And ultimately, though, the decision to put turboprop engines on it, as opposed to developing some sort of jet, along with many governmental and political factors, is what eventually led to it no longer being feasible. After losing quite a bit of money in the last few years, Saab decided that they were going to cease production of the 340 in 1998. The 340 came in multiple variations, typically having between 30 and 40 seats in its configuration. They were powered by two General Electric turboprop engines, depending on the variation, developed between 1,700 and 1,800 shaft horsepower apiece. There still is around 200 Saab 340s in operation around the world, although being smaller carriers that usually use them, they are not typically seen as much as back when they used to be used by larger companies such as American Eagle. When I was a kid, it seemed like we used to fly on these all the time. My dad worked for American Airlines, and American Eagle being one of the subsidiaries of that, we would often fly American Eagle for regional flights. And going back and forth between Tulsa and Dallas, it seemed like the Saab 340 and the Super ATR were the two airplanes that were being used exclusively. We'd often end up flying on the 340, and at an airport the size of Dallas Fort Worth, it was interesting how you would have to go into a separate area. You'd go downstairs in this terminal. It was Terminal A. You'd go downstairs. You'd have to go out onto the tarmac, get in a bus. Then the bus would drive you out to where the airplanes were parked, and then you'd have to get onto the airplane out there. It's just a kind of that little bit of a feeling of the way things used to be, even in a large airport, having that old feel of having to actually go outside, not being on a jet ramp. It was just kind of a cool experience that I'll always remember. We used to do that a lot, and then that was phased out with the introduction of the ERJ 145 when American Eagle started flying those a lot. Those became exclusively used in place of the 340s. But I think the last time I saw one actually being used by American Eagle would have been maybe only 6 or 7 years ago. So it hasn't been all that long since they've been phased out in that capacity. But the 340 really is still a relatively young airplane. With the extension of the lifespan to 90,000 cycles back in 2016, most of the 340s still should have an expected life of another 30 years. Typically, there would be two pilots, a pilot and a co-pilot, and then one flight attendant, and in most configurations was around 34, 35 passengers. I'll be the first to admit it wasn't exactly the most comfortable airplane. It was small. It was loud, but that was part of the fun of it, wasn't it? I think the best angle that you can look at the 340 is from head on. Its horizontal stabilizers, the way they flare up like that, think it's just pretty cool looking. The 340 could cruise at about 300 miles per hour, had a service ceiling of 25,000 feet, and with range of just over 1,000 miles, it was an ideal airplane for those shorter regional type flights. In the end, while we don't see it much anymore, it used to be an extremely common sight, especially in some of the hubs like Dallas and Atlanta and Chicago. But it's just a cool looking airplane. It had sort of a short blip in history, but I think it's something that's worth being remembered. If you enjoy talking about stuff like this, hit that subscribe button and hit the bell so you get the notifications whenever there's new videos. I'm hoping to put out new videos on a regular basis and to continue to develop the quality of them so that we can go more in depth on some of this information and get deeper into the subjects. And if there's something specific that you'd like to talk about, like to share in the comments, I'd love to hear that as well. I'd love to hear about what's interesting to everyone out there as well. It just occurred to me, I have this little Saab 340 right here.